Hello, friends. Welcome to our Southern Community, your public affairs program exploring the people and the issues of the environment, energy, and economics throughout the region. Today's program is a visit with Alan Muscat, author, forager, instructor, teacher, and the master of mushrooms. We'll sort this out. Alan Muscat, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
We were trying to determine just what accolades and descriptions there are for you. Yeah. You have been so busy in the field, literally outstanding in the fields and in the forests, hunting down the wild mushrooms. And that's what we want to talk about. Not just the environmental and the edible aspects, but the economics of it as well. Alan, what got you going onto mushrooms?
Yeah, thank you. I have to take notes on your puns, like in the field. I think I'm missing that one, but I think it was the economics. I have to admit, and this is kind of like a dark secret. They were free, you know? And I can look backwards at a lot of good reasons, like the health of it and getting in touch with nature. And I think back then, the reality of it was I didn't want a job. I wanted to get out of the system, you know. Admittedly, I did want to get, in some ways, like back to nature. I did have some awareness of the health involved because this was just coming out of college when I hiked for the first time. I cooked for the first time. That led to health food. And I'd say the third thing I did was I had a course in Taoism.
In college?
Yeah, in college, in like Eastern philosophy. And Taoism's a lot about cutting out and like getting natural and getting out of the system. And of course, and that was 2,500 years ago. But it hadn't really changed.
You look awfully chipper for being in college 2,500 years ago, Alan. Let's get the calendar a little closer here. When were you in college?
In 91, I graduated. It's funny you make that. That's a joke I do have already in my list, which is that that smell I told you about earlier when we started.
Yes, we are recording live at the time on location here in north of Asheville at Alan's secret undisclosed mushroom location.
And I have cooking a what's called in China the mushroom of immortality. The joke, I usually am a little more conservative, and I tell people I've been drinking it for 300 years. So check in with me in another few hundred to see if it's working.
I realize this is radio, but ladies and gentlemen, he looks fantastic even for 200 years. Well, Alan, the whole idea of foraging for wild mushrooms is one that, at least to me, just kind of conjures up an individual wandering more or less haphazardly through the woods and the forest and carefully picking the right one and hoping it's not poisonous and so on. But in fact, this is literally an art and a science that goes back thousands of years. Fill us in a little bit of the history of the mushroom itself in terms of humans.
Yeah, I like to say that BC, before Costco, we all were foragers. Right? So when I talk about the health of mushrooms, I tell people, like, you know, this is what we evolved to eat. Yeah, thousands, I mean, tens, hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's not that they're good for you. It's that anything but wild food is bad for you because it's a very newfangled thing. And I'm not just talking about, you know, frankenfoods. I'm talking about grain.
The processed food we're all looking at today in terms of the wheats and corns and so on?
Not just processed food. There were studies of mummies in ancient Egypt that had like all the diseases of civilization. And it's because they were eating bread, particularly, white bread, refined stuff. But just to have a diet mostly based on grains, even whole grains. That's why we all take omega-3s. You hear about essential fatty acids. That's due to the fact that we eat too much grain. And when you forage, you're not foraging a ton of grain. You're foraging mushrooms, like I said.
Through the lens of history, the grains that we originally had as humans would be just a handful of really chewy things that worked out, as opposed to truckloads and barge loads of it. It would be I have no idea, but it would be a small percentage of what was being foraged.
Well, before corn, which was like the last 3,000 years or something, you had a few thousand years of lamb's quarter, which is very common, local, relative to amaranth and quinoa. That was the staple grain for a few thousand years. And you can get, a good amount of that. I mean, I have a gallon of it sitting in the kitchen. But I think the fact of the matter is, when people hunted, like, they didn't bother with grains. I mean, what would you choose? A bowl of rice or, a steak? Like, a no-brainer.
Even today, we face the same dilemma for some people anyway. Mm-hmm. Well, what I would be curious about, and I've asked other folks this, but never an expert, so this is my chance. What's your guess, or what do you know about how we determined which mushrooms were safe to eat and which weren't? Now, obviously, if Org fell over dead after eating the pink ones, they put it together, but it's just a hit or miss proposition. Has there been any look at how we sort it out? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of wild mushrooms are not a good idea to eat.
Well, I'm glad you asked. First of all, here's the breakdown. We have maybe 30,000 wild mushrooms on the continent that you might eat, large enough to consider, not molds, that are fungus also. Out of those, only a dozen, depending how you count, are deadly. Less than 12, a handful that we know are deadly. There are about 200 or 300 commonly eaten ones. And then there are 200 or 300 that will make you sick, anywhere from stomach ache to wish you were dead.
The seasick level of, you won't, but you wish you will.
And that leaves vast thousands of them that we just don't know. But we don't suspect them of being poisonous because they're all closely related to ones that are edible. It's pretty reasonable to conclude that the vast majority of mushrooms are perfectly harmless. A second question is, how did we find out? So your odds are good if you're going to play, fungus roulette.
I'm sorry to laugh. That's the way I look at it sometimes, but fungus roulette, go ahead.
But the fact of the matter is, if you ask the people who are actually making these discoveries around the world, meaning like you do an anthropological study of, let's call them shamans, right, in the Amazon or something. Because people ask this question more so about medicine, like, how do you figure out that this is good for this, and this is good for that, or that you had to process it this particular way too. If you actually go and ask these people, they don't tell you it was trial and error. What do you think they say?
I'm stumped.
Yeah. So this is where the pharmaceutical companies are going, right, to come up with, like, the next medicine that they can patent. And you can just imagine this guy in his hut, right, with the loincloth and stuff. And they will universally tell you around the world, they will laugh, first of all, and say, how do you think I know? I asked the plant. I asked the mushroom. So these people, like, they're not divorced from a method of communicating.
The natural environment that has been part of their culture for however many thousands of years.
Yeah, I think it's the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, where she's walking and she sees these beautiful flowers and she goes, I wish you could talk. And the flowers talk back and they're like, we can talk as loud as you and a great deal louder. She's like astounded and she's like speechless. And I think it's the rose speaks up and she goes, it's not polite to speak till spoken to, and we were really wondering when you would ask.
And so here we are asking the mushrooms and the native plants what they can do for us, and right behind us is the pharmaceutical companies. I'm trying not to be too cynical, but it's one of those odd things that strikes me is that how many billions of dollars are being made, but when you track back, 95% of all medicines are from nature. That's where they originally are developed. And at the same time, there seems to be a lack of awareness that we need to protect that nature just in case we might need another medicine. Although that's a selfish reason, that's a pretty good one.
Yeah. There's actually a project I'm working on now through WNCA, the environmental group, to explore what is commonly known as non-timber forest products, things that you would forage or even farm that necessitate healthy woods. And, in this day and age, you need an economic reason, to convince people not to cut down the woods. And this is a reason because the ginseng, let's say, is worth a lot more than the lumber that you would get. But in my case, I'm looking at mushrooms that you could grow.
Which are not mutually exclusive with the ginseng, and that awareness that there's a greater economic benefit from however many acres of forested land than just the revenue from clear cutting and taking out the wood it does actually seem to be sinking into more and more folks these days.
Yeah, and when I teach, to actually bring it back to your last question and what may come across as awfully woo-woo about talking to mushrooms, I use a comparison, I think came from one of my old co-teachers, that if you think I'm like a great teacher and that you can learn a lot from me, you're not going to cut me up and eat me, You're going to get a lot out of having a relationship with me, aside from my eating my body.
Alan, we started off with a chuckle and a bit that it was the economics of free mushrooms that might have been the spark that got you going on it. But today, the economics of wild foods, foraging, and mushrooms in particular, but it's not limited to that, really have begun to grow their own legs, so to speak, in terms of the local economy, certainly here in the mountains and throughout the Appalachians.
I was just on the phone talking about a new Wild Foods Market. What's opening in December is a place called Mushroom Central that my friend Joe Alowas is opening, where they're selling materials for growing mushrooms, going to sell mushrooms that they've grown, and I may do a class or two there on wild mushrooms. And the idea that Joe revived that I've had for 7 years is to have something that looks like a tailgate market, except instead of farmers, you have foragers. And he invited us to do that in his parking lot in West Asheville. I'm also in discussion with a larger location because I have a feeling it would be popular enough to be really bottlenecked by the small lot that he has. So we're not sure we'll get it off the ground there, or even whether we'll get all the details and the regulations in place for this spring. So I'm not sure how soon or where it will be, but you're right. The momentum has really picked up. There's a lot of interest both in buying it and selling.
What would some of the crops, the products, the foraged items be?
Mushrooms, of course, but like you said, there's also plants, and the plant parts are going to be things like greens, roots, seeds, fruit, shoots. Those are the categories I put in. And that runs in season here from April through October. You could safely say that there are each month at least 30 different things that you can harvest wild. And across the season, about 125 of what I would call common edibles. In mushrooms, you have very commonly chanterelles, morels, chicken of the woods, maitake, it's also known as hen of the woods. And those are your top 5, I think I've named. There's maybe 2 or 3 more. And then for plants, people have heard of ramps, of course. I mentioned lamb's quarter, also very common. Nettle is a very common edible. Dandelion, everyone's familiar with, trying to get rid of it.
Dandelions are one of those things that nearly everyone knows it's edible. They've heard of dandelion wine. But the idea of eating the dandelions or making dandelion wines from your yard in the chem lawns in the cities, it's not very appealing. In the wild, what are the dandelions like? Exactly the same thing, just not a lawn full of them?
Well, see, that's sort of one of the misconceptions that I think, keeps me in business. It's not just the fear of wild mushrooms being deadly, but, you're mentioning contamination, which is a real concern. However, I don't go into the wild for dandelions or for probably any of the greens that I would name as the top 5. They're all weeds. And you can have urban places that are uncontaminated. Like my front yard right outside is a hefty producer of chickweed. I've picked baskets and baskets of it in a yard that I know isn't sprayed. There are what we call waste lots, because nobody's using them and no one is spraying them. I don't know about plants, but I know that with mushrooms, you don't want to be picking them anywhere near a contaminated place. They will actually be used to clean up the environment because they suck it up.
They absorb different toxins and so on. I read a little bit about that in terms of some toxic cleanups.
Yeah, I mean, oyster mushroom. It will be something that you can plant in a mulch pile 4 by, say, 8 across, and you can dump crude oil on there. And the oyster mushroom will not only suck up all the hydrocarbons, it will digest them to a point where you'll find none of them in the mulch pile, and you can eat the mushrooms.
The mushrooms would be edible. I'm asking again. You clearly just said that, Alan.
Yeah, you can test, and you'll have 99.99% of the hydrocarbons gone from the mulch pile and gone from the mushroom that ate it and digested it.
Well, that seems like a remarkably cost-effective way to treat oil spills. I mean, there's got to be some questions with scale and so on, but fungus spores and oil spills, it would seem like, why isn't it done on a larger scale? Let me rephrase the question like that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's called mycoremediation. It's not my area of expertise. Most everyone who's looked into this has heard of Paul Stamets. He has a TED Talk. He's a pioneer, and he does promote this. My specialty is largely restricted to, edible and medicinal mushrooms. So,
well, let's look back at that. You have been teaching a range of classes on this for 20 years now?
A little under 20.
What's been the reception from the general public as far as are they enthusiastically getting on board with it? Is it still some skepticism? Is there a legion of foragers that race out every morning to scour the forest? Or we just kind of pinprick onto the population, getting them on board?
I have to say, I mean, had you asked me, 3 or 4 years ago, I would say things are pretty good. But about a year and a half ago, 1 to 2 years ago, things just started taking off. And in the past year, it's exploded. I know Time magazine said foraging was the next culinary obsession back in January 2010. And that was a foodie thing. And yeah, it was about eating local. The truth is, the true local food is what's wild. I mean, it grows local. And a lot of people think of sustainable agriculture, and they're buying food that's being grown in a place where if it doesn't grow naturally on its own, without a lot of input, you're not growing local food. And so permaculture would be growing what does perfectly fine on its own, what's wild. It's not necessarily native, but they're not invasive either.
And there's a resurgence in the last few years of the self-reliance aspect and sustainability, and the local foods movement as well has really, it seems to have gained some traction. I'm thinking of Chef Disson with his specialty dishes, and the restaurants around Western North Carolina being apparently are an eco destination unto themselves already for some of the food. So this all kind of links back to me to part of what is of a portion of a sustainable economic system around the area, where at least some percentage of it are the natural, locally available wild foods as opposed to agribusiness.
For better or for worse, most of the people that are forming that explosion in interest probably could care less about the earth. What they're wanting to do by prepping is save their own skin, or they want to save money. Like in Cuba, it's by necessity that this is happening. I'm not sure that it's because people think it's healthier for themselves or the environment. And so I'm getting a lot of interest from people interested in self-reliance. Isn't it just a foodie thing? And I wondered all those years when I was going to get some, some respect for voluntarily.
You've been ahead of the curve for decades on it, and now...
Right. I mean, my grandmother's favorite line is, "For this, he went to Princeton?"
Every grandmother's lament.
Yeah.
And many parents as well.
Right. And my parents were, just didn't get it until they started seeing me on TV and the magazines, and that I could actually make money at this. So for them too, it was the bottom line.
When we think about the bigger picture, that gets pretty big.
I decided to call my teaching No Taste Like Home. All right, like no place like home.
The Wizard of Oz,
Yeah.
Dorothy.
Yeah. The amazing thing is for a logo is that I discovered Dorothy's always carrying a basket. And she's always trying to get back home. Of course, she has Toto in the basket most of the time. If there's one thing that, symbolizes a forager, you're carrying a basket to gather food. For many years, I actually got tired of foraging, and I was sick of it, and I wanted to quit because I started to gather for restaurants. And so for most of those, 15, 17 years, I turned this into a business of being a commodities broker. People couldn't believe when I would tell them that it was like a grind to have to go into the woods foraging, because I had a quota to meet, orders to fill, and it wasn't fun anymore. In encouraging the Wild Foods Market, I don't want to make this just an economic thing, either about eating or making money for people, but to have them feel at home so that they don't feel a pressure to pay the bills, because they know there's a tremendous amount of abundance out there. It's basically the Garden of Eden. It has always been there. There's enough food for everyone, even at this population.
Well, that leads us into the direction, at least in my mind, of the sustainability of the foraging in terms of the plants, the mushrooms, the products themselves, and sustainability. There have been so many examples of overexploitation of the natural resources, it's pointless to even list them here. What if loads and loads and loads more people went marching off in search of the wild mushroom? What's the capacity, would you guess, on that?
You have to back up and understand that we don't have a choice. You have to say, well, what's the alternative? That may sound horrifying, but look at what we're doing now. The single most devastating thing that humans have ever done to the planet is agriculture, destroying wholesale millions of acres of woods and just bulldozing them to grow staples like grain. So when you think, and imagine people ransacking the woods, to pick some plants or mushrooms, there's no comparison. Beyond that, secondly, first of all, people don't even realize that mushrooms are just like berries. If you pick a mushroom, you've taken the fruiting part of a fungus that's still in the ground or in the log. This is why you can grow shiitakes on a log. You pick all the shiitakes, more come. They don't come out of nowhere. They come from the fungus that's perfectly fine in the wood. So people can ransack the woods for every single mushroom that's in there, and they're going to come back. And if you miss a mushroom, 1 million spores literally will come out of that one mushroom. That's how many. And so the reason we're not covered in mushrooms is because the environment isn't there to support the mushrooms. It's the habitat that's being destroyed by factory farming, by growing monocultural mega fields. So it isn't foraging that destroys the forest. It's not foraging that's going to destroy the forest.
Alan, that certainly provides a far more sobering and appropriate way to look at the differences between foraging and agriculture, and it's certainly food for thought on a lot of levels. Yet, again, I'll play the devil's advocate. There have to be some items, and I guess the one that comes to mind is ginseng, that if there's too many people digging it, that are digging the root, that aren't allowing it to grow back, and so on, that would be, in essence, endangered by even more attention to bringing them out. There's already problems with ginseng.
Again, you have to look at the big picture. The other day, a couple people died from eating mushrooms in California. And of course, I got the forward sent to me. And I was just imagining, I'll go ahead and do it right now. Like if somebody interviewed me, I'd say, a couple people dying is not a big deal. And we tend to focus on the small picture. But the fact is that, again, the wholesale destruction of people's health by not eating wild food is a much bigger deal.
Posing the question, how many people die from alcohol in McDonald's?
Exactly. How many people die from the pharmaceutical system every year? Or how many people are completely impaired by diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all caused by civilization, by our unhealthy lifestyle? But I do want to answer your question. And the fact is, yes, we've pretty much wiped out ginseng, pretty much wiped out golden seal. Like it happens, but the solution isn't to try to stop it from happening. The solution is to empower, to prevent it, to educate people and create a culture where we understand that, we depend on these woods and we share these woods. It's a fundamental challenge that doesn't have to do with like saving one owl or one salamander, right? Or one species of plant. I mean, it's a fundamental question of like, do we see ourselves as individuals or as part of a whole? That's something you have to confront in your spirituality. It's a religious question. And I think that people can best learn that by doing. I was vegetarian, many years ago. I thought I was doing the right thing. Now I think I'm doing the right thing if I go and I hunt and I kill that animal myself. I have to deal and see what's happening. Instead of, living on grain that's fed with like blood meal and bone meal and from animals, grown on habitat that is taken from animals to be grown, and yet it's invisible to me and all I see is a piece of bread. So I think you're going to have people surprisingly be far more responsible. Like maybe not all hunters, but hopefully, some in a growing culture of realizing, this is our home, acting a lot more responsibly than a corporation that you're, buying your bread from.
And I would hope there's also the nature embrace factor, which I guess is the opposite of nature deficit disorder. If you can get people out into the woods and let them experience, all of a sudden they discovered lunch. There's something to bring home for dinner and kind of get past that distinction, the separation between nature and man. It should generate more respect and more awareness, you would think.
It's the same question, with like, say, gun control or like issues about pornography or something. And so you want censorship. So you try to like keep people, safely away from this dangerous thing. And, and the truth is like you can't solve things that way. You just have to educate someone, empower them rather than try to like protect the woods from people. You can't do that. I mean, it's like drug control, right? I mean, you outlaw something, then someone is going to get around that, and because the price is going to skyrocket for that product. It's just that sort of a fear-based approach that always backfires if you don't instead, like you said, expose people to it and let them experience, what works.
Has most of your response from folks been positive and supportive? And I'm thinking it's a kind of a general question, but there's skepticism, there's is it poisonous question, and so on. But across the board, it seems most people will probably at least be mildly curious, if not actually flat out really interested.
It's a good question, and I really wonder because I want to start a project where I do free classes around the region because we have a hunger problem that's enormous, third in the country. It's kind of hard for me to believe, but I understand there's a TV show in West Virginia where they, I think it was Jamie Oliver, tried to educate people to eat like more healthy. And I understand that it failed. Like you couldn't convince these people, to eat more healthy.
We've been eating fried chicken for 400 years.
Exactly. I don't know how easy or hard it will be. You do have a ginseng hunting tradition here, and even morels are fairly well known. When I drive by a yard and it's got a mushroom in it, people are, very receptive to letting me pick it, and they're curious when I explain that you can eat it, but they still are afraid to. They still won't. Maybe when they see me on TV, they'll believe me. But
that was the famous guy. He was in our yard, and I saw him eat it on TV.
Yeah, it takes a while. It will take a shift, and again, it may be by necessity, but one of the hardest things to shift is people's diets. Part of your childhood and what's familiar. It's part of what's sad about teaching wild foods because people would laugh if you said, I took a class on wild foods. It'd be like saying, I took a class to learn my carrots and oranges and apples. They grew up with it, and you don't buy a field guide. I mean, we didn't have to pick up a book to figure out, what are the vegetables in the store. We just grow up with it.
Well, welcome to America, where much is separated. Yeah. Alan, the educational initiatives and efforts and so on, because you've been involved with a whole lot of them over the years, have you seen much of an evolution in that? And I'm curious from, say, 15 years ago, holding up a picture saying, this is a mushroom, it won't kill you, till today saying, here are the edible mushrooms, and they really could have an impact on our local economy. It just seems like there's some evolution possible in the years you've been teaching and providing educational programs.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it's very recent. You know, I don't know if it's a critical mass. You take reishi, for instance. It's an interesting mushroom because it flourishes on dead hemlock. And you may know we have a hemlock blight. And so the silver lining on that cloud is that we're going to get, hopefully, increasing numbers of this mushroom of immortality. That's what I mentioned earlier.
Which is what's cooking while we're interviewing.
Yes. Yeah, I have it boiling in the other room. And having picked, 50 or 75 pounds of it this year, I'm finding myself running out already. And the people who picked 200 pounds are sold out because I've gotten more interest in this mushroom than ever. And it's about time because it's anti-cancer, like most mushrooms. And 2 out of 3 men are getting cancer and 1 out of 3 women, in the culture. But I think we've sort of been in denial of that until recently, or of the fact that we need to be self-reliant. And somehow there's, again, a sort of a viral, as you want to put it, or fungal, networking going on.
We're watching the spores spread slowly.
Yeah.
I've loosely followed the wild foods and foraging efforts, movement, whatever the appropriate term is, for 10 or 20 years. And it seems like it's been a slow but consistently incremental step up every year, every bit, and now maybe it has reached that critical mass.
Yeah. So I usually open my classes asking, okay, what does home mean to you? And what does wild mean to you? Most people don't fall into my trap, which is that home is, where my friends and family are and where I feel comfortable and safe. And wild means like uncontrolled and unknown and dangerous. And,
out there.
Yeah. And you have that expression, we're not out of the woods yet. Okay, well, where is home really? Is it, in this box, that we make for ourselves? The funny thing is, most of the people coming, I don't have to convince them of that. That's why they're in class already with me. So I can look at deeper things like, why is it that we don't feel like we have enough most of the time? Enough what? Money or food or friends or love. If that's what home's about, that's all around us. And you might want to come here, you're thinking, I just want to eat healthier, or save some money. But the truth is, we live in this fear culture of individualism and separation because we don't have that sense that we're always family, not just humans. I can go outside and there's my friends. And that, if that sounds fruity, that's the problem. That's what we're facing.
There's not enough fruity people out there going in the woods to talk to their friends.
Yeah, and I swear, I did not grow up this way. I grew up in Miami, cutthroat business, bottom line, and that's why I get the for this he went to Princeton. And I came at this, like I said from the beginning, because the food was free and then because I could make money at this.
What are some of the upcoming classes, educational topics, and so on the foraging and wild foods that you'll be participating in, leading, or otherwise? We can tease the listeners with a couple of options. I think you've got a couple of things coming up in the next few months, don't you?
Yeah. By the time this airs, I will have spoken on a panel on nature and natural wellness. So it's a combination of, how can nature contribute to our health and well-being? And it's at Om Sanctuary, which is going to be a new sort of Omega Kripalu spiritual healing center, a retreat center in Asheville. I'm going to be teaching there in April for a week-long wild foods retreat, and then in September. And so in April is probably your best time for plants, wild foods, and in September, mushrooms. So that's coming up next season, because this one is pretty much winding down. But come late March, early April, you'll have ramps and morels, and it will run through September. And inside of that time, I am going to teach probably 50 times. There'll be public walks. I'm going to be doing a sliding scale midweek walks for locals. I get a lot of tourists on the weekends, but of course anyone can attend either one. I'm looking at doing a more involved certification program where someone can really study all of those 120 wild foods through the season and forage with me and come out of there prepared to teach wherever they are. A lot of those things grow all over the country.
What's available to train, to teach, to certify, as opposed to, hey buddy, want to buy a mushroom?
Gosh, I don't know. I'm aware of herb programs, and I teach at many herb schools, just get certified as, say, a clinical herbalist. But in terms to be a certified wildcrafter, I'm not aware of any. I think the market that I'm helping to start is the first ever in North America, at least in modern history, of course. And the training might be as well. And I think it's certainly important with more people picking. In France, every pharmacist is trained in identifying the most common mushrooms. So you can walk into a pharmacy and ask the pharmacist, check these out for me.
Is this safe to eat, or what variety is this?
Yeah. And, in Africa, there's an expression that you would hear on the street anywhere, and it's the one who asks is the one who doesn't get poisoned by wild mushrooms.
Wise word. The other one, the early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese.
Yeah. And that's what I'm hoping, is that we create a culture. It's really happening in Asheville, where there are lots of people now, besides me, who know they're wild mushrooms. This is the other reason I don't pick to sell them. I have too much competition now. I've taught myself out of the market.
Now, Alan, you're also an author. How about a quick rundown of some of your books for information of people that would like to read about some of your adventures and discoveries?
Thank you. In fact, I meant to say that this winter, cross your fingers, I'm going to finish and publish by spring my book on wild mushrooms. It's what I include if you take my class in a short version that's now outdated, but I've been revising and expanding, mostly with jokes and stories.
Well, we have to laugh. It's part of a good life.
Yeah. And there are videos, clubs online where you could send pictures and have them identified. You can join a local mushroom club. We have a very strong one here.
What's the name of that?
The Asheville Mushroom Club. Community is really the bottom line with foraging. It's not, like you said at the beginning, the lone secretive mushroom hunter, It doesn't work well that way.
It's teamwork.
Yeah.
Alan, we are just about out of time. Any final thoughts?
I'm online, of course, and I have a couple websites, but the other one I haven't said explicitly is called The Real Center. This is a project to help people deepen their relationships with each other and with nature. And basically to get real, because as I see it, we live in an artificial reality. People are out of touch, with nature, each other, and with themselves, with our human nature. And that's pretty difficult now for most of us. So that's therealcenter.org, and that's TheRealCenter.org. And for my wild foods, it's notastelikehome.org. Yeah, and you'll find it if you just put in Alan Muscat mushrooms or mushrooms Asheville. It will not be difficult.
Alan, any final words of inspiration?
This comes from Elizabeth Robbins Pennell, 1894. And she said, "But however they may be served and eaten, mushrooms you must make yours at any cost. Learn to like them, will to like them, or else your brief sojourn on this earth will be a wretched waste."
Alan, thank you so very much for the conversation, and have a great winter.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.